makes a great crisis management team? I don't know about you, but I'm really fascinated by crises. Why is it that some organizations can be faced with a major, significant disaster, a real crisis, and yet they seem to be able to manage through it with some ease? Others, not so much. When you think about what makes a truly great crisis management team, you could no doubt come up with a really long list. In my 35 years of practice, I kind of narrowed it down to 3 things. First of all, a well-defined crisis management team structure and process, one that has clearly defined roles and responsibilities, a formal assessment process, and the ability to create an action plan. Secondly, clear command center principles that include pre-identified locations, documented processes and staffing, and an information management system. And lastly, a plan for crisis management team development, because after all, it's about practice. Let's take a look at my agenda. What I want to talk about today is I'm going to talk first of all about some definitions. I'll talk about the 3 things that I've already mentioned, and then I want to specifically talk about your challenge in actually creating this. And then we'll talk about summarizing successful crisis management. So let's first of all look at definitions. Now, for the past few months, I've been working on my 4th book, which is a crisis management book. And one of the things I start with is a definition of crisis management. And I know that might sound really silly because you're probably all thinking that we all know what crisis management is. Not so much. It really depends on your vantage point. And the definition of crisis management really depends on who you ask and who they are, because every profession has a slightly different angle on it. So business continuity, communications, crisis management, technology, they often look at it from a kind of a different angle, so they have a different definition. And I would just ask you at the end of this webinar, do a quick search of what crisis management is, and you will discover it comes up with quite a plethora of responses and approaches. So what's the definition that I'm going to be using today? I thought that would be important for us to sort of stop and reflect on just for a moment. Because many definitions of crisis management have a particular angle or view. First of all, you need to sort of sit back and ask really what your interest is. And it depends literally on what that is. So it could be all about reputation and brand. It could be all about communications and social media responses. It could also be about the continuation of critical business processes. It could also be about the continuation of technology. It could be some combination of all of those. Or perhaps it only addresses what executive management does at a time of crisis. So it really depends on your perspective. So for today, what I'm talking about literally is the definition that's used in the ISO standard 22399 on operational continuity management. To me, it has kind of the broadest framework of which for me to talk today. So it has a holistic management process that identifies potential impacts that threaten an organization and provides a framework for building resilience with the capability for an effective response that safeguards the interests of key stakeholders, reputation, brand, and value-creating activities. So for me, this definition really encompasses all of that. It encompasses the issue of brand management and crisis communications and business continuity and crisis management and technology, which is why I happen to like that one in particular. So let's talk about these 3 things here for a moment. As I mentioned at the very beginning, you need essentially 3 things to make an effective and great crisis management team. You need a structure and a process, you need command center principles, and you need a systemic and iterative team development plan. What we're trying to achieve in all of this, and this applies to anybody in any aspect of crisis management, is that we are looking for what I call the 6 C's. We're looking, first of all, for the ability of command and control. When something bad happens, when we have a true crisis, we're not going to get together and have a long meeting and discuss and brainstorm about what we're going to do. We need to have a clear approach and direction. We're looking for command and control. We also, however, though, want to look to be able to collaborate. And it's not just internally within our organization. It could be to other locations within our company, but it could also be outside of our company. It could be with public sector officials, emergency responders. It could also be with the news media. So how do we collaborate with them? And then how do we coordinate our response? And that's certainly internally, and especially if you have multiple locations. We're looking for an effective communication response, and ultimately what we're looking for is consistency. The public in particular will grade us, if you will, on the fact that our approach may vary from situation to situation, and that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for a consistent response. So let's first of all talk about crisis management team and structure and process. And there's a lot to peel back in this particular section of my talk. And the first question I would ask all of you is, how are you thinking about organizing your team? Now that may sound kind of silly because you're thinking, well, I'm just going to have a team. Well, no, there's actually a lot to that question. Most companies actually have a tactical team and a strategic team. So what does that mean? The tactical team members are going to be representing key departments, and they're very much a managerial level. They're managing a tactical response. So they're actually making sure that our business is actually, our business continuity plans are enacted, that we're actually accounting for our staff, that we're assessing building damage, that we're looking at our technology and our infrastructure. They're doing all of those tactical things, and they're obviously activating their plans. The strategic teams, however, are the executives, and their approach is quite different. And they're really looking at the overarching strategic issues for the business. I'll talk more about them in just a minute. These tactical teams is what I want to start with, though. And the question is, how do you organize them? And the question I would have is, are you organizing in your usual reporting structure, so your usual organizational chart? Are you considering something like the incident command system? Or are you thinking about something else? So let's peel that back here for a moment. If you use the usual reporting structure, so the good thing about that is that it's something that everybody knows. I mean, after all, it's what you do every day, right? It's your actual overall arching process. So it's something that you know. But there's a couple of downsides to it, actually. First of all, the span of control may be too large. Now, what does that mean? There should be somebody in charge of your crisis management team. I don't know what you might call them. You might call them a incident commander. You might call them an EOC manager. You might call them the crisis leader. There's lots of different titles I've heard. But if you think about having every department in your tactical team, which could be a lot, so let's list some of them that might be there. Facilities, security, technology. You might have safety and health. You might have HR. You'd have communications. You'd have all of your key lines of business. You might have legal. You might have finance, you might have risk, you might have insurance. I've already listed 13 groups right there, and there might be others as well. So our one person would have to talk to 13 people to be understanding what was going on in our incident. That's way too large a span of control. And the span of control for most organizations, as you're looking for, is somewhere between 5 and 7. There also might be too many silos of responsibility to be effective. And so what does that mean? If everybody's in their normal reporting structure, then that means very likely what they're going to be reporting up is not only to our person that's in the command center, but very likely to their manager. And then you can begin to have some actual silos that begin to occur, which can be very problematic. I mean, who ultimately is in charge? And it should be the person who's leading the crisis management team, not their usual boss. Because please remember, in a crisis, this is not your day job anymore. This is your crisis job, and it's different. There could also be duplication of effort, or things might be completely missed altogether. And that's because, again, we are in these small silos in our departments. And therefore, also, there may not be clear authority. So there's a plus because you know it, but there's many downsides, which I've listed here. A vast majority of our clients actually utilize the incident command system, and I'll just briefly mention it here. It was created actually in my fair state in California in the 1970s when a bunch of wildfires went poorly. That process was developed and is now actually used throughout the United States. It's required by all public sector entities, so starting at the city, county, state, and federal levels, everybody uses ICS. And it's used in many large companies across the United States. I've taught ICS in actually 4 continents. It's used around the world as well. So it's actually a very effective process, and it's been required, as I mentioned, since 2005 for all federal, state, city, and county agencies to use ICS. So the emergency responders who come to your facility are all using ICS. It has a very clear reporting process, and it has 4 specific teams 5 counting communications, and it reports up to an incident commander. I'll just mention how these are very commonly organized, just to give you something to chew on a little bit. Under the operations team, those folks are really what we would call our doers, if you will. They're ones that are actually have the response activities. And so usually in a company incident command system, you'll see in operations, you'll see usually 3 departments: facilities, security, and technology. And those are all places that are the major infrastructure of our company. And they also can be the ones that you would go to immediately to be doing a damage assessment and reporting the ability to occupy a building, utilize technology, and so on. So they work together very closely. Under logistics, in a company EOC, you'll most commonly find those emergency operations center. You'll most commonly find that to be human resources, really dealing with our human capital. In a public sector EOC, you'll also find that logistics will be there. It will be purchasing, but we find it doesn't work very effectively in a public and private sector command center, and that's usually in finance. Planning and intelligence is where you're going to find all of your key lines of business, their business continuity plans. You might find legal and regulatory compliance. Under finance, you're going to find all the cast of characters you might expect: payroll, procurement, risk, AP, general ledger, the basic aspects of treasury operations. There's also a communications team, which would include everything related to communications, internal, external, social media, and then that reports up to an incident commander in the command box. And as you can see, our incident commander really almost has to talk to 5 people, because there's a person in charge of each one of those teams to find out what's going on. So for many companies, and certainly for the city-county model, it really is an effective way of managing and organizing. So the first task I would say to all of you is, how are you organized? Think carefully about that. And are you going to use your usual system of reporting, or are you going to use something different? And you might use something like ICS. Maybe you don't call it ICS. Maybe you just organize your teams in ways that make sense. But it does have a lot of advantages to actually do that. So once you're clear about the structure, now you can go to step 2, which now you can look at roles and responsibilities. You want to make sure that every person who's assigned in your command center, who's in the crisis management team, has a very clear role and responsibility, and every position has a checklist, which means what do they do when they get there? What do they do during the basic operation of the command center, and how do they help shut it down? You may say, well, I don't really need to do that because everybody knows their job. And I would say, well, no, not really. First of all, it could be a significant crisis and we're all frazzled and we don't even know why we're there. We just showed up because we're, that's our job, but we're frazzled. And so we don't know where to start. We could have not done any practice or training in a long time and we're very rusty and we don't remember. Or the third option might be that literally the situation is so serious that many people don't show up, and the people that do show up are completely untrained, and they need a checklist to even figure out what their job is. So that's actually really important. You also want to make sure that your plan and your checklist actually fit your expected risk profile. I mean, why are you going to be activated? So I would expect to see, if you're in a hurricane environment or an earthquake environment, those are large regional events, that your checklist will have more depth, because you're likely having people show up that maybe don't have training. And I will also say to you that this situation is likely to go on a heck of a lot longer than perhaps a more smaller and contained event that's only happening to you. So then let's get down to the role of the executives. So what I've talked about to this point is really the tactical team. So what about the executives? Where are they? Well, ideally, they're not part of this tactical crisis management team. They're not really dealing with plan activations and assessments and so on. They're taking all of that information that comes up from that tactical team, and they're looking at things broadly and strategically. When we actually write an executive crisis management plan, we actually look at the 4 roles that we think that they're going to be doing. And these are the ones that we advocate in our client population. First of all, they have a job of providing strategic and policy oversight. So they're looking broadly at the strategy issues affecting the company and the bigger policy questions that might have happened as part of this incident. And that's really important thinking, and something that somebody needs to be thinking about pretty darn soon as our event unfolds. They're also going to be actually approving large expenditure requests that are going to be coming up from that tactical team. So if you're replacing a large number of servers, or you have to procure a certain amount of equipment, or get a lease on a new building, or any of those things in order to manage the event, it's very likely that those are going to exceed the signing authority of that tactical team, and they're going to need to move it up to the executives to make a strategic decision on the expenditure. A really important job that they have is acting as what I call a senior statesperson. What does that mean? It's kind of like a relationship manager. And what they're doing is they're reaching out and speaking to other key senior stakeholders. So first of all, you want them to be addressing your employees, but they would be also talking to your big customers. Maybe they're discussing with the investor community if you're publicly traded. They'd be obviously informing the board of directors. They might be talking to the mayor or the governor or some significant political officials. So you want a senior person interfacing with another senior person, and there's probably a long list of people that they need to communicate with, and that's a key part of their job. And then lastly, in some cases, they might be acting as a media spokesperson if the situation warrants it. Now, in many events, of course, the CEO or any of the executives are not going to be on camera. It's usually the corporate communications person, which is totally appropriate. However, in some cases, think of an active shooter and maybe several people are killed at your location. Who's going to really probably be up in front pretty soon in the incident is going to be your CEO or a very senior executive, because when a really bad thing happens, you really want to hear from the most senior executive about how the company is managing and what's going on with the employees and the organization as well. So that's a critical role. These are the 4 things that we recommend that executives really focus on, but this requires that you have a specific plan for them. It's often quite short, maybe just a few pages to be honest. And what it does is it talks about these roles and it contrasts it to the tactical team who's doing the tactical recovery. So that's the first part of this section about team structure. The second part of this section is really talking about assessment. Of all the things that I look at when I look at a crisis management plan, which we're often asked to audit, is that many times it is completely silent on how the team actually comes together and any decision about activation is made. So what I would ask all of you is to pull out your plans and take a look at them. Does it say clearly who comes together when you have an incident? And does it also say who makes the decision about activating any plan or team? And what is the criteria that is used? And is this a documented part of your crisis management plan, and do you practice it? Sounds silly, but I will tell you, I often don't see this. What we advocate is that people have an incident assessment team. And this team is tasked with the job of literally assessing incidents as they come up. So first of all, who should be on this team? And I will tell you very commonly, the people that we see are, first of all, 3 almost always: facility, security, and technology, because those are the 3 places in most companies where incidents come from, just by the very nature of what they do. You might also have in there maybe a key line of business that has a very, very significant and short RTO, recovery time objective. You might have the person in charge of the crisis management team. You have a business continuity professional who runs the business continuity program. And perhaps you might have an HR person or maybe a communications person, but you could certainly add them if you needed to. So we're looking at a team usually it's got around 5 or 7 people. They always know that they're on call to be called kind of day or night if there's something that comes up. And generally what happens is that things percolate through their normal reporting mechanism as they normally do, either through facilities or security, or maybe there's a technology outage or however it happens. And once it hits a tripwire, if you will, this team comes together and actually assesses the event. You should have very clear definitions about what they do. Their job is to conduct an initial assessment. Their job is secondarily to review the criteria and the escalation strategies for this plan activation. And then they call the question, do we activate the plan or not? And we advocate strongly that any of these members of this team should be able to activate the plan and the team, because after all, in a crisis, especially a regional crisis like an earthquake or a hurricane, you may not be able to get a lot of people on a call, and everybody should be empowered to be able to communicate. As far as communication, you want to determine where they're going to meet. Ideally, it's a conference bridge. Ideally, you're utilizing your emergency notification system to send out a notice to all of the people on the incident assessment team that they need to get on a bridge in order to assess an incident. You also want to make sure that you've determined where they would meet physically in case for some reason communication systems are down and you're unable to reach people electronically, they would know where to go. When the team first comes together, the first thing they do is gather what we call situational awareness. And that simply means what the heck is going on? What do you know? And to have a quick discussion about what's impacted. Is it our facilities? Is it employee injuries? Is it our visitors or customers? Are there impacts to the business? Anything about reputation? What's the overall effect? So there's a broad discussion under the big umbrella that we call situational awareness. And in that particular discussion, we also ask you to think at this moment about these three areas. Is it a local event? Is it just you, a power outage or a fire? Is it a broader event that might be regional? Maybe it's a widespread power outage, or it's a big earthquake or a flooding situation. Maybe it's a national event. So if you remember 9/11, when that occurred, there was only 3 places in the United States where there was a physical impact: Washington, D.C., New York, and of course, Pennsylvania. But the entire nation, for the most part, shut down. Most of our clients closed, all crisis management teams that we work with activated, and the country went sort of dormant. So everybody was impacted, even though the effect was only in 3 locations. And you could even actually, frankly, get together for an international event. There could be a tsunami that impacts one of your locations. You might have some flooding or typhoons, or you have people that are traveling in Mumbai and there's a big bombing or a fire event. So it's not just you that you need to think about. There are 5 topics that we always ask people to talk about when they come together to discuss anything in an incident assessment team. We used to have really long, complicated criteria, and frankly, there's only 5 things you ever need to talk about: people, facilities, technology, business, or company reputation and brand. And basically, you sort of step back and ask the question, are people's lives in danger? Is there a life safety issue? Is there some impact to people? Secondly, in our facilities, is our facility at risk, or are buildings that we're able to occupy them? Number 3, is there some sort of impact in technology? If so, what it is, or is it possibly an information security related concern? The 4th one, are you able to perform your mission critical, time sensitive business activities? Does it impact your customers, and will it have a significant impact on your financial events? And then lastly, does this event, especially if it's not handled well, have the potential to impact your brand or your reputation? And that's, of course, a more subjective issue, but important to discuss. So we ask that our teams literally, first of all, gain situational awareness. They hear everything they need to know about the situation. They then broadly discuss the 5 topics: people, facilities, technology, business, and reputation or brand. And then we basically call the question. In this assessment process, if you utilize a severity level, it's important that your team then assigns it. Is it a level 1, 2, or 3? Is it a high, medium, low? That's actually, it sounds kind of silly that you might say, gee, I need to have one of those, but severity levels help you it's like shorthand. If severity 1 is the easiest and severity 3 is the worst, and somebody says, oh my gosh, we have a severity 2, you already know what that kind of looks like. So it's kind of like shorthand, if you will. So I'd encourage you, if you don't have sub-levels, that you look at that. What happens is that the team, I basically ask them to call the question: does the incident meet our activation criteria? And if the answer is yes, then you're going to activate your crisis management plan, you're going to activate your emergency operations center, and you determine where that is, or is it going to be virtual or some combination thereof. Once a team is activated, that initial assessment team or incident assessment team that we just talked about, they basically fold into the crisis management team, so they don't exist independently. And now, of course, you're informing your executives. If the answer is no, then you still probably want to be monitoring that situation, because if it was bad enough to get on a call, it's probably bad enough to keep your eyes on it. And you want to, at that point, have somebody assigned, determine how often you're going to keep people informed, and you kind of continue to move that forward. So the assessment process, really important. I would ask you all, if you have an existing crisis management plan, pull it out, look at it. Is this clearly specified in your crisis management plan? If not, this is a homework assignment for you. The 3rd issue is another area that I often see that people don't have. clear guidance on in their plan. And that's how to develop what's called an incident action plan. This is probably one of the most important aspects of crisis management, and yet I rarely see it documented. What is it, this great thing? What an IAP essentially is it only has 4 little things in it. It has the overall status of the event, again, situational awareness. It has very specific strategic objectives that have been written, and the person assigned to them, and there's actually a date and time of what's called the next operational period. What does that mean? Once you develop an action plan, you will work on that particular action plan for a period of time until your team comes back, shares status, and also learns more new information, and then also develops new objectives. That's called an operational period. At the beginning of any activation, it could be quite short, and then over time, it will get longer and longer until maybe it's even 12 hours or even 24 hours. So an IAP, it sounds so simple, and frankly, it really is, but most people don't do them. And so if you don't have a structured way of building an action plan, what often happens is that at the end of your initial briefing and meeting, people kind of run around doing what they think they're supposed to do, but there's no clear direction. The advantage of an IAP is that you can print it, you can send it to anybody who needs to know what you're doing, you can share it with the executives, other locations, and it keeps everybody on track. It prevents people from double working on something or something not getting addressed at all. It should always be written because it allows for certainly less confusion and miscommunication, but it allows for it to be easily shared. This could be written on the back of a piece of paper. Ideally, you've got a laptop you could drop it into, you could share it to people, but it's really simple. The steps in building an IAP are really straightforward. You always start with your incident assessment and your situational awareness, and you're doing that all the time. So at the beginning, you start with the baseline, and then what you want to do is you want to add on. And first of all, you want to think, where are you going to get that information? I know that also sounds kind of silly, but where are you getting all of your information and how are you validating it? We'll talk more about that when we talk about situational awareness in a bit. But where are you getting the information? Your employees, your vendors, maybe it's emergency responders, maybe it's traditional media, social media. So where are you getting your situational awareness? Then you want to write your very specific objectives. And many of our clients, they have pre-established objectives, kind of standing objectives, and they modify them based on the incident. Because it's easier to start with words on a page than a blank sheet of paper in a crisis. And you kind of know what you're going to be thinking about, so you could actually commit pen to paper and write many of these in advance. Then you want to make sure that every objective is clearly assigned, either to a team or an individual. And then lastly, you determine the operational period. When are we going to meet again? So maybe it's 2 hours or 4 hours. If something big happens in the middle of an operational period, you of course would come back together, but otherwise you're working the plan, which is why we have one. And then lastly, you're going to communicate. Who are you going to communicate that plan to? So executives, maybe other locations, certainly the team itself, maybe some business units would get it. But really, it's so helpful in keeping everybody in the same page. So in my first section, I've talked about 3 things: structure, how you're organized, what your teams look like, how you assess an event, and how you write an action plan. Each one of those should be documented in your crisis communication or your crisis management plan, so it's very, very clear about how we even get started. So our team is activated. We go to the command center. Have we thought about how we're going to be organized? Again, that sounds kind of silly, but many people don't spend this time in advance. And this is certainly things that you can really practice and build out in an exercise. So first of all, when you organize your command center, keep in mind these 3 things. Location. Where are your physical locations? And do you have a virtual location? And if so, what's that about? Then what you want to be doing is you want to be thinking about the process. How are we organized and how are we staffed? And then thirdly, how do we get information in? What do we do with it? And how do we maintain our situational awareness? So let's peel back this 3 sets of things under command center principles. First of all, location. Where do you locate your command center? We basically look for most of our clients that we expect them to have designated 3 locations. The primary location should be at your main location, wherever that might be. That's assuming, of course, that the event hasn't disrupted it. Where do you want to be in that primary location? Many times I'll go into what people have established as a command center, and it's a boardroom. And that's probably the least ideal place, unless it's your most senior executives. For a tactical team, they should be in a large space. Maybe a training room would be great, assuming you don't have a physical, designated, permanently hot location. A training room is great. It's got audiovisual built in, probably certainly maybe drop-down screens, projectors. It's big enough. It's got multiple tables, because you don't want to have one large table, but you want to have multiple tables to really have people work in clustered teams. It's got to have enough space for everybody. And think of noise, and think of air quality, and think about all of those types of things. So the best spot is really a great training room, and maybe one that has breakout rooms nearby. A secondary location should be away from your main location, because if you had a fire in your building, now you've lost your command center. So where are you going to meet? Is there some place within a reasonable amount of travel time based on your risk profile? So if you don't have such things as a regional hurricane or earthquake, this secondary spot could be literally more than likely maybe a mile away. Maybe there's a hotel nearby that you could actually immediately go in and rent a business center room or a conference room or something like that. Or maybe there's some other location that might be of a convenience, or maybe you have a secondary site that's 10 miles away. But you want something that's a reasonable amount of travel time based on your risk profile, but it cannot be your main location, and that would be your secondary site. If you do have a situation as a regional event, such as an earthquake or a hurricane, you may need a third designated spot. So for example, I live in San Francisco. My clients in the Bay Area have 3 sites. One is their office. Their second might be some area that's maybe 5 to 10 miles away. And for many of them, it might be about 50 miles away for their tertiary location, because again, of the damage that's expected in a large regional earthquake. Same thing for hurricanes, and also for my clients in Washington, D.C., because of the threat of both chemical and nuclear warfare in the Washington, D.C. area. Their tertiary site is often 50 to 75 miles away from their site in general. So think about location. This should all be predetermined. You don't have to staff or have things available necessarily at the secondary or tertiary site, but you should know exactly where you would go if the primary one is not available. Thing you should be considering when you look at a command center is, first of all, emergency power. Is power outage part of your risk profile? And if so, what you want to be doing is you want to be thinking about emergency power. You want to make sure you have enough room. And again, as I mentioned earlier, a boardroom or one big table is not ideal. It might work for an executive team of 5 to 7 people, but for a crisis management team that often has 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 people, it's awful. A big table, also from a psychological perspective and from a process known as group process, if you have one big table, people have a tendency to think with one big head. I mean, everybody works together, and that's not how it works in a command center. You need lots of small teams, so we're looking at a way that we can break people up into likely work groups. Think again about that ICS model. Ideally, we got some breakout rooms somewhere around that we could do small briefings or conversations, or maybe places that we could go listen to the news or something like that, so we're not having the news blasting us in a command center. Ideally, it's got some wall space so that we can display things. That's either electronically or even paper flip charts, maps, anything like that, so we can see what's going on. Status boards, in particular, holding static and dynamic information. We want to also make sure we have all the equipment we need, so that would be printers and copiers and computers and phones and office supplies and all that kind of stuff. And then lastly, we're going to be there for a while. So do we have access to things like kitchens and bathrooms and maybe even showers or places where people can go rest? Those are all things to consider when you select where you're going to have your command center, and especially your primary site. You should really think through this in a logical manner. You also want to look at this idea of process and staffing. And I mentioned about room organization, but I just want to mention it one more time. This is really important, and I find that many times it's not thought out at all. I would want you to think about how are you organizing your team. I'm a big advocate of having people sit in smaller tables and teams, not one large table, because it makes such a huge impact on how the work is going to be accomplished. So, and how are they displaying information? Does every team have their own status board? Is there some status board in the room that has the static information of the event? Is there something that has more dynamic information? Are you using LCD projectors, or are you using plasma displays? How are you displaying information? And that's really important, because we're making decisions based on that displayed information. And it should all be accurate and up to date and clear. So think about that. And who actually is responsible for updating that? What's the staffing for that? Many times people don't consider what the administrative staff requirements are in a command center. Really important. Who's going to be making copies? Who's actually putting stuff on the flip charts and maintaining status boards? Who's answering the phone? The people that are running the command center shouldn't be really answering the phone. They're busy. They're working on plans and processes. Who can help them so they can actually focus on their task, not answering their phone? And even to that extent, what I would say to you is, if you're utilizing mobile phones and people come into a command center and they've got their mobile phone with them, many times we ask people, just put your name on the back of your phone and throw it to the whoever the people are that are, not throw it, but hand it to people that are actually doing the phone answering, because they need to do their job and not answer the phone and get distracted. So think about ways that you can make it easier for people to do their job. And part of that is a really good administrative support staff that's going to be taking care of your command center in real time. This also has to be considered for virtual centers. So, of course, it's nice to be all in the same room, not always possible for lots of reasons. People can be all over the country, but also because of our event, they may not be able to be in one location. So having a virtual center or a combined physical and virtual center is also important. And how are you going to do that? Probably the worst way to do it is by conference calls only. It's impossible. I often kid my technology clients because they run so many things on conference calls with no other electronic support. And it's impossible in my mind anyway to keep track of what's going on and manage the information. So you want to be thinking about tools to do that. So there could be electronic collaboration tools, and I've listed three that are, or four that are very commonly used in our client population: Slack, Yammer, Envision, Google Keep. Those are all options. They're a little more limited, but they certainly are better than simply a conference call. Some of my clients actually use webinar platforms like GoToMeeting or WebEx. Again, that has limitations, but you could show slides, you could show video, you could do a variety of things. One of my favorite ways are looking at online learning education platforms. And if you haven't looked at those, and if you've gone, certainly if you've gone to college or any kind of formal training in the last few years, you might have participated on them. They're really helpful because they have lots of things that you can add and do. They're called learning management systems. Adobe Connect's one of them, Blackboard's another. There's quite a few. You can Google that and get a sense of them. When you look for this virtual environment and you're saying you want to go out and sort of shop around for how you might be able to organize yourself virtually, you want something that has the ability to create conference calls and maybe multiple conference calls running all simultaneously so that we can kind of be in our virtual rooms. And these separate virtual rooms can be very handy because you can have status boards in there, you can have timelines posted, and that's all very helpful. It'd be great if you could also be able to display video or images in some way. So maybe you had a fire and you're trying to have actual video footage of the fire or images of the rooms that have been damaged. Map displays, which could also include floor plans. And then also some sort of document storage would be super handy as well in this virtual environment. The third thing on my list of command center principles is really looking at information management and situational awareness. And I will tell you that I often find that people have not put any time and thought into this issue, and yet it's hugely important, hugely important. Situational awareness, as I mentioned, is the ability to identify, process, and comprehend critical elements of information. What's going on in regards to the mission? It basically is, what do we know? And situational awareness comes to you from many, many, many different areas. It's simply knowing what's going on around you. And that's an important thing to stop and say, how am I going to do that? How is that information going to come into the command center? It's going to come in many different places. How do we all pull it together? And how do we actually do something with it then? Because remember, your team is making decisions based on situational awareness. There's actually a great something called the OODA Loop, which I love. It's been around for many years, and it's basically a very simple process that was developed many years ago by United States Air Force Colonel John Boyd. If you Google him, you'll find some really great writing on the concept of situational awareness. And it hasn't been modified or changed much since it was originated. And it basically deals with 4 steps: observing, orienting, deciding, and acting. And just to briefly look at that, the classic, what he called OODA Loop. And this is important for you to think about when you think about your leaders making decisions, because this is what happens. I would also say to you, this is the same decision tree that you use every day in your life, but no one's probably ever drawn it out for you like this. So the first part under the observe is that you're observing and you're taking in information from many different places. There's a set of unfolding circumstances happening right before your eyes. You're taking in any kind of outside information. And this also has some explicit guidance and control that's going on at the same time. So we are observing, and almost simultaneously, we are orienting, which means that we are taking our previous experience, our background, any new information, our cultural traditions, and we are trying to figure out, with the information that we've obtained by observing, we are trying to orient ourselves to what the heck that means. And then what happens is that once we've done those 2 things, then we actually do 2 things, and often in pretty rapid succession. We make decisions and then we act. And let me just give you a personal example that you can think about for yourself. If you imagine you go into a movie theater tonight, you're off to see a film, and you're in the dark, and the lights go down, the movie comes up, and all of a sudden, you start to smell really thick, dark smoke. The lights never come back up, and all of a sudden, you start to hear sirens. Immediately, what are you thinking about? Oh my gosh, I got to get out, right? So stop and think about it. You're taking in the information, the smoke, the lack of light. You hear sirens. You might hear people screaming. You might hear people moving around, and you're trying to take in all of this information. At the same time, you're orienting yourself about what you know about the theater. Where was the exits? Did you ever pay attention to those green little signs to say exit? Or are you going to go to the back of the theater where you came in, where everybody else is going? So you have to make all of these quick decisions under this observe and orient. And then once you've got all of that in the hopper, you are going to make a decision and then act. So we personally do this all the time. That's what happens in a command center every single day, every single moment. How can you bring in that information under the observe section to really give them what they need in order to actually make decisions? Critical piece of a command center. Situational awareness is really important. And as you see on that slide, there's the famous physician who was dragged off United Airlines on April 9th. And that's a still capture, as you can see. So when you get situational awareness, people begin assembling key facts under tremendous amounts of confusion and uncertainty, and you have to assess now how you're going to deal with that information. And you have to wonder, how did United Airlines wait so long to do anything? So here you have multiple sources of information. Do not forget social media. You know, United is that incident happened on April 9th in the evening. They didn't do or say anything until the next day, well into the day. And of course, social media had blown up all night long in that particular situation. And painful for that airline. Sort of embarrassing for me. I've flown 2.5 million miles on United, and I love them, and I wish that they'd done better. With situational awareness, our decision makers, so just think about your tactical decision makers in that team, and plus our strategic decision makers, they are taking the situational awareness that they are given, and they have to take that information and project forward the implications of that information, which is this is all in the pre-decision making time. And they have to anticipate the consequences of this fast-moving event. So the situational awareness is so critical. The information that is taken and packaged and given to them so they actually can make decisions in a cogent manner. Then they have to develop, of course, an alternate course of action potentially, and they have to assess which decision or which plan has the most promise of dealing with the situational awareness. Situational awareness is not available at the corner drugstore. You have to figure out how you're going to get it. So what are your sources? How do you verify and validate that information once you get it? And then how are you going to display it? And how do you keep it current so that people can see it who need to see it? And how do you display historical or static facts? So there should be some place in your command center where there's literally a static board that has the facts of the incident. What time did it start? Where did it start? What are the initial impacts? Those facts that will not change, so that when a new person comes in, they can look at that static board and they're immediately up to date. If you don't have that, you're kind of wasting time and energy trying to keep people on track. Situational awareness. Go back and look at your crisis management plan. How do you have figured out the process for how you organize your teams? Do you know where you're meeting? How do you manage a virtual space? How do you deal with situational awareness? And how are you, again, staffing that command center? All critical aspects, critical command center processes. Lastly, I want to briefly talk about team development. What does it take to make a great team? I'll just tell you this, it's practice. There is no way around this. You need plans and processes, and you need management support. You need all of those things. But what is going to make your team great is by practice. There is no way around that. How much practice? People always say to me, well, how much do I have to practice? We always say this as our general rule. For the first year a team is in existence, we basically recommend 3 exercises. The first one's going to be an orientation exercise, relatively short, maybe 2 or 3 hours in length. And primarily it's looking at a plan and using a really simple narrative to walk through looking at a plan. Whenever you do plan review, you have to do a narrative, because otherwise people never really dig into it or think about it. It could be simple, you know, a simple fire, a simple flood, something. The second would be a basic tabletop. And the third is an advanced tabletop, and that means it's actually simulated. So a basic tabletop, I always kid people about them. We do basic tabletops is primarily at the very, very beginning of a cycle. But once you've done a basic tabletop, you need to be advancing your team and their skill set. And an advanced tabletop is actually simulated, where all of the exercise injects, which are those things that move the story along, are handed out by paper. We're not using slides, and they have to go talk to a simulation team member to actually solve those. So there's an engagement, and they actually have to do something. They have to solve the problem. And then from then on, 2 exercises a year, an advanced tabletop or a functional exercise. And after they get really good, you could actually do a, a advanced or functional tabletop and maybe a very simple walkthrough. Again, the more practice they have, the better. One of my favorite things to do with people is to teach them how to do what I call rip from the news. Rip from the news is actually a fabulous exercise in which you simply grab a newspaper, flip through it. There's probably an exercise on every page. Find something that might be appropriate, a fire, a flood, a shooting, maybe there's a cut in fiber or cyber breach. Take a moment to frame it to the organization that you're in and go. This is a great way to practice incident assessment. It's a great way to practice cutting an action plan. It's a great way to practice initial staffing up, setting up a command center. You could do these in a meeting. You could spend 30 minutes, 45 minutes, do it several times a year. And what you're going to find is that people are really going to get good because, again, it's all about practice. So that leads me to your challenge. So I've talked about the 3 things that I think that you need to have, but we actually have a challenge, and I call it the good news, bad news challenge. The good news is that most companies don't have a major activation during any given 12-month period. That is the great news. The bad news is most companies don't have any major activations during a major 12-month period. So what does that mean is this. I call this the Chicken Little moment, if you will. Now, I'm not advocating that any of you become Chicken Little, so I'm not advocating that approach. However, how do you answer the question that you're going to get without a doubt at some point with no activations or very minor activations on any given period, which is the question from executives, which is, what have you done for me lately? I've done many talks on this topic, and I've actually done one that's on for Everbridge, which is in their webinar archive called a return on investment. But let me just say to you that this is an issue that you need to really think about, because if you haven't had many activations or none, most of my clients don't have any in any given year, then building a program becomes more challenging because After all, you're not using what you have, even though you can point to every risk that you have in the universe. But what happens is that executives begin to have a natural increase in risk tolerance and appetite, because after all, they haven't had any problems, and they haven't had the problems that you've talked about that's been in the BIA or in the risk hazard assessment. So it becomes challenging. So what I would say to all of you is one of your tasks is really thinking about the solution, which is really two things, I think. Really is education and ongoing education on a regular basis with all of the key stakeholders, executives all the way down to your employees. And there's a certain amount of overt and what I call covert marketing. So what do I mean by that? Overt marketing can be things like whenever there's a national month. So for example, September is National Preparedness Month in the United States. You should be doing a lot of activities in your organization promoting preparedness. April is Earthquake Month in the state of California. October is Fire Month in the nation, promoting fire safety. Those are all things that you can get behind and talk about the importance of it. And things like that, whether you have safety fairs, those are all great overt marketing. Covert marketing is more where you're constantly keeping your executives apprised of the risks that are present. So for example, in our clients, what I do is I set up Google Alerts whenever we work with somebody to sort of monitor not only the name of their company, but also their industry. And I might add things like if it's a particular, let's say it's a manufacturing facility and they're in a hurricane-related environment. So my Google alert might be hurricanes, manufacturing, outage or something like that. And then every day, Mama Google sends me a list of those concepts and articles that have been written about over the last 24 hours. Super handy. You can begin to actually get those established, and then you can send them to your executives so they learn more about, oh my gosh, this just happened to a certain location or to maybe a competitor, or it's helpful. Because if you don't keep them apprised of what's going to happen possibly to them, they're going to forget, because that's what we do over time. It's just human nature. So overt and covert marketing, I highly recommend it. And I would encourage you to search the Everbridge webinars for the one I did on return on investment, which has lots of ideas related to that. What I want to conclude before we talk about questions is really successful management of a crisis does require several things. It does really require clearly defined and documented team processes and clear team roles and responsibilities. You've got to have an initial assessment process and a team figured out and worked out, and you also need to know how to actually write and develop incident action plans. You need to really make sure that you've got well-defined command center processes and practices and staffing. And then lastly, you really want to be looking at regular training and exercises, because what you're trying to build is muscle memory. I can't emphasize that enough. If you do everything but you don't do any exercises, your team is not going to have any muscle when they need it. And that's what we're trying to build every day in our work. So on that note, I'm going to hand this back to Will, and we'll see if we have any questions.
All right, thank you, Regina, for that great presentation. As a reminder to the attendees on the call, you can submit your questions by typing a question into the open text field in the questions panel on your screen and submitting it to all panels. So Regina, the first question we have from the audience is, should plans be written on realistic possibilities?
Great question, absolutely. So this goes back to really understanding your risk profile. So I would ask that you look at your risk profile, whether your organization, sometimes business continuity does that, sometimes that's done in the risk department or insurance. But first of all, really get a good risk hazard assessment. But then I would also say to you that there are certain things that all of us, regardless of where you are under threat right now. And that's certainly an issue of cyber-related breaches. And all you have to do is Google ransomware or anything like that to have a sense of how you need to make sure that you have really peeled back the cyber-related threats as well. So look at your risk hazard analysis, and then also really dig deep on the cyber side. And when we talk about cyber, it's not so much the prevention and the mitigation, we're talking about the impact of the event from a crisis or business continuity perspective.
All right, next question we have is, what did you mean by functional exercise?
Great question, thank you for that. Sorry to use that term if you're unfamiliar with it. So in our world of exercise design, there's 5 types of exercises. There's an orientation exercise, there's a drill, there's a tabletop, there's a functional exercise, and there's a full scale. A functional exercise is actually fully simulated. What does that mean? The exercise starts with a baseline narrative, and you've got a series of injects that you've developed as part of your planning process. Those are things that are inserted into the exercise. The way they're inserted is not by slides. It's not even by pieces of paper. It's all live. So most of the injects that we would design for a functional exercise are delivered by phone calls. So I have a simulation team sitting in another room, and they're delivering these phone calls into the exercise environment. If you're standing in that room, I'll tell you, it feels like the real deal. So the person answering the phone has to talk to somebody, find out what their problem is, try to find some solution to it, just like in the real world. If they don't have the answer, they have to talk with their colleagues and figure out what the answer is, call them back. We also would drop in injects by things like videos. So we do a lot of videos like news broadcasts or things like that that show what's happening. So it's fully simulated. And that's something that is a great thing to advance to. Once people start doing exercises, I think tabletops are great. But don't keep your team in a tabletop exercise, which I call a blah, blah, blah exercise, because all you're doing, you're talking about what you would do. At some point, you have to advance them to getting beyond what I would do to this is what I'm doing, and engaging with a simulator who will say, well, that's not going to work, and pushes back, because after all, that's what the real world does. The real world doesn't give you everything you want, and that's something you want to teach your teams.
All right, thank you. Next question we have is developing these items, testing and educating staff and executives someone's full-time job?
That's a great question. I think it really depends on how large your organization is and probably what your risk profile might look like. I will say to you, in most of our clients, again, business continuity, it may be a part-time related function for a smaller organization, maybe less than 500 people. But once you start getting above 1,000 in particular, you're going to have somebody whose job it is to actually very likely do business continuity and crisis management. And then as the organization gets larger, then additional staffing would be required for that. But certainly when you first get started, you want to spend some good quality time figuring out these processes, because you don't want to figure out a process and then go, oh gosh, that's not quite right, and then you have to train the team again. So spend time up front making sure that you've clearly figured out how you're going to organize your team, all the processes, and then roll it out, and so that you're not messing with it over and over again.
All right, one last question here. How does the crisis management plan differ from the business continuity plan?
Great question. So in the world that we live in, which I'm using that word broadly, business continuity management, looking at the ISO 22301, if you look at that for a moment, there's basically 5 types of plans that we're talking about. And let me just ask you to visualize with me for a moment 4 silos across a piece of paper. The first silo is emergency response. The second silo is business continuity. The third silo is disaster recovery technology. The fourth silo is crisis communications. So emergency response, business continuity, crisis communications, and disaster recovery technology. Those things are, there should be plans for each one of those silos. If you have a piece of paper and you have those 4 silos on them, draw a big umbrella over the top of that. That's crisis management. So crisis management manages, if you will, all of that inbound information of those plans. So business continuity is about recovering time-sensitive, mission-critical business processes. Crisis management plans are how you're going to restore and recover the entire company. So it's taking all of those 4 silos I mentioned, coordinating that response, and being able to then move the company forward. So crisis management is the overarching umbrella. Business continuity is a segment that feeds into crisis management.
All right, thank you. And with that, we have run out of time. I want to thank you, Regina, for another great webinar, and all of our attendees who were able to join us today. As a reminder, you'll receive an email with a link to the recording and the slides within the next couple of days. And if you haven't already, please take a moment to follow us on Twitter at Everbridge. Join our group on LinkedIn, Everbridge Incident Management and Emergency Notification Professionals. For those of you interested in requesting a one-on-one demo of the Everbridge or to learn more about critical event management, please visit everbridge.com/request-demo. Thank you all again for joining us today, and we hope to see you online again soon. Have a great day.